welcome to this session. We appreciate all of you being here, and I'm really thrilled by the turnout, and especially all the young Montana students. And I hope you're as inspired as I am, and you have more time in your lives to do something with this than I have. This is an exciting morning for me. I read a lot of Donald Worcester and Holmes Rolston when I was writing my dissertation, quite a while ago now. And Christopher Preston has collaborated with me here. We've done some big projects. And Dan Spencer, I'd have to say, is a beloved professor on campus. And Dan is going to be moderating this session. And Dan Spencer, right here, is an associate professor of environmental studies and has taught at the University of Montana since 2002. Some of his areas of teaching and research interest include ecological ethics, ethical issues in ecological restoration and globalization, justice, and environmental issues in Latin America. For the past 8 years, he has served on the board and taught at the Wild Rockies Field Institute, which has allowed him to visit some of Montana's most spectacular wilderness areas while educating a new generation of wilderness advocates. He was born and raised in California and received his BA in geology from Carleton College, Minnesota in 1979, and Union Theological Seminary in New York. And I'll turn it over to Dan Spencer.
Good morning, everyone. I've been so looking forward to being on this panel because of what the two panelists are going to present to us today here. I'll introduce Holmes Rolston and Christopher before each speak, and then after each is presented, I'll pose a couple questions and then open it up to our audience here. We are really fortunate this morning to have two generations of environmental ethicists represented here on our panel. For those of you familiar with the field of environmental ethics, Holmes Rolston is one of the foundational members and has really been one of the most important persons for the last many decades, helping us to think through the ethical issues around taking seriously the environment, nature, value in nature. Christopher Preston is a more recent member of that field, and one of the wonderful things is these two have a deep friendship that has largely been forged in wilderness. They've taken several trips together in wilderness here in Montana with Smoke Elser, we heard from last night and is out here in the audience as their outfitter. And so these are folks who reflect on the ethical imperative of wilderness, not only from a conceptual framework, but from a deeply experiential framework. They have had a lot of firsthand experience with wilderness, and that has influenced and shaped their reflections on that and their conversations with each other. So let me introduce now our first speaker, Holmes Rolston, and I'll be fairly brief with my comments so you have more time to hear from him. Holmes is the University Distinguished Professor of Philosophy at Colorado State University, so he shares our northern Rockies bioregion, but from a few states south in Colorado. He's written a lot on the issues that have influenced environmental ethics, including most recently, or among his most recent, A New Environmental Ethics, The Next Millennium for Life on Earth. I first became familiar with some of Holmes's writings through a book that was deeply influential in my field of theology and ethics called Genes, Genesis, and God, which came out about 15 years ago. But he has other titles, Philosophy Gone Wild, which addresses some of the issues we'll talk about today, Environmental Ethics, Conserving Natural Value, and has edited a book called Biology, Ethics, and the Origins of Life. He's written chapters in 80 other books and published over 100 articles. But I think most importantly this morning, he's been a frequent visitor to Montana and to Montana wilderness areas and has logged hundreds of miles in Montana wilderness. So please join me in welcoming Professor Holmes Rolston.
Thank you. Nice to be back in Montana. And I want us to think together about half a century of wilderness, about what I call a three-dimensional life. Wilderness for people, and you see an exclamation point, but also a question mark. Wilderness as social construct constructed by man, or perhaps impossible because of human hands, and conclude with thoughts on the world that runs itself. Almost 50 years ago to the day, Lyndon Johnson signed the Wilderness Act. Not long after he signed the Civil Rights Act, so we have to learn to be more civil, and we have to learn about residing in wildness from these two acts, as we've been doing for half a century. Maybe Montana could be a good example of being both more civil and more wild. Originally, we had 54 areas, 13 states, now 758 areas, about 5% of the landscape. But half of that's in Alaska. If you include Alaska, about 5% of the U.S. landscape is wilderness, but if you leave out Alaska, 2.7%, an area about the size of Minnesota. Montana's got 16 wilderness areas, 3.5 million acres. You might say 3.7% of Montana is wilderness. I've been in Montana. Here's Smoke Elser in the audience. Smoke, maybe you've been on a horse too long. Maybe you haven't been enough, if this is where you're taking people, the Chinese Wall. I think I've been about 500 miles in Montana wilderness. Even got Christopher out there once. In the wilderness, we are a visitor who does not remain. The question is, are we a part of or apart from wilderness? And when I'm out there riding on horseback, I think about that. Life sets up territorial boundaries. That's ancient, and humans too set up territorial boundaries. But maybe, as we were hearing from Don in the previous hour, we've reached a kind of new high point in the human role on Earth. Thinking of wilderness as a moral and social goal, because now we don't just defend our own territory, we set aside and defend territory for others, not our own. In that sense, we set ourselves apart, don't we, by consciously setting apart these areas for others. And I don't think that's ever been done before on Earth by any other species. We want an Earth that's part culture, part wild nature. A couple years back, I was in Arizona, in Apache National Forest, in quite wild territory. Once upon a time there, the young Aldo Leopold, fresh out of Yale University, well equipped, we think here, recalls that he shot a wolf. We think this is probably where he shot that wolf in then wilderness area, and reached the wolf in time to see green fire in her dying eyes. He later wrote of my sin against the wolves and thought that his evolution in his own morality, thinking about wilderness, was one of the milestones in moral evolution. And he had something to do with restoring wolves to Yellowstone. I think in Yellowstone, mostly Yellowstone, some in Minnesota. I've seen perhaps 100 wolves. As far as we know, Leopold never saw another wolf. At least he never mentions it in his writings. He did help to found this wilderness society, which launched the Wilderness Act. And I think looking back, we can see that it was encountering a wild other that triggered what I call thinking big about the big outdoors. Now I want to claim that if we're going to be three-dimensional persons, we've got to think urban, we've got to think rural, and we've got to think wild. Aristotle said we're political animals. The word political deals with the polis, or the city, and we do live in towns, cities. We are in a city town at this moment. Yes, we need cities, but you can't see that out of your penthouse window. The rural and the wild. May leave us placeless. It's kind of like being in front of a television set. You're digitally everywhere, but actually nowhere. Children play their digital games until they have nature deficit disorder. We worry about the last child in the woods. Yes, people who live in cities need to know that they need environmental support, they need wheat from the plains, but also Americans love their landscape. I grew up in the Shenandoah, loved the Chesapeake as well as Montana, the desert Southwest. We know we belong to the land. The land is grand. Montana is a mountain state. West Virginia, the mountain mama. We sing America the Beautiful. We need to be sensitive to values that are already in place before we arrive there, and get a sense of embodied residence on a landscape. Why save the Grand Tetons? Why save the Grand Canyon? Because they're grand, aren't they? It's fairly easy then to move from is to ought, to celebrate, to conserve the beauty in nature. And we do think that life would be impoverished without these experiences of beauty, rural and wild. But now the exclamation point and the question mark about wilderness for people. Well, we need wilderness, we hear, as benchmark. We need to save biodiversity. We recreate in wilderness. People need wild nature to show what they can do. But to be let in on nature's show. Put shortly, we need to wonder, and life is wonderful. Wonderful. We have a sense that the underlying natural world is the fundamental ground of our existence. Yes, we are political animals. We have to be citizens, but we are embodied creatures. We are earthlings. All three dimensions, urban, rural, wild, protect our sense of identity, past, present, and future. So in that sense, wildness is a museum of our roots, but I like to think of it as an ongoing, living museum. We learn where we came from and begin to learn who we are. Leopold found himself on a moral frontier, on the western frontier. Leopold wrote, we get a sense of kinship with fellow creatures who wish to live and let live, sense of wonder over the magnitude and duration of the biotic enterprise. In that sense, if you like, wilderness puts people in their place. Oh, yes, it's not where you live when you are in wild lands, but you realize your culture is superimposed on natural systems. Are we going back to? I don't know that I like the back to metaphor as much as I do the down to, something in, with, and under our existence. We recontact natural certainties. Montana is a mountain state. Montana is the big sky country. Mountains, forest, big sky, they are among the archetypes of the foundations of the world. Forest, sky, everlasting hills, cycling seasons, photosynthesis, food chains, speciation, genetic codes, succession, its resetting, life, death, life renewed. Forest is a kind of presence and symbol of all these natural givens. Good for people, but we have to be careful how we say that. Here's a statement, a report some years back, restating wilderness is for people, benefits to society, not set aside for the sake of its flora, fauna, but for people. Well, they overstate, I think, and mistake the goal of wilderness. Yes, it's for people. We once had at the entrance to Yellowstone the sign, "It's a pleasuring ground for the nation and its people." don't see that there anymore because we aren't too sure we like phrasing it that way. Glenn Cole, Yellowstone, said, Yellowstone is a natural community where nature takes its course and people learn to take pleasure in it. It's a better description, I think, of our goals. But we are going to get critics who say, well, wilderness is a construction in the human mind. Here's Rod Nash. Wilderness is a state of mind. Civilization created wilderness. Now, I know Rod Nash. He's a marvelous environmentalist. But he shouldn't have said this. David Lowenthal, an excellent British geographer, wilderness, not a type of landscape at all. The congeries of feelings about man and nature, different in different times and places. Create. Philosophers can look at that word better perhaps than geographers or even historians. Yes, there's a legislative meaning of create, and in that sense we do create wilderness. But there's a biological meaning, and in that sense we do not create wilderness. Wilderness created itself long before civilization. Everybody knows that, and Rod Nash does too, because he's run the Colorado River as a rafter many times. So what am I thinking when I'm out there in the wilderness? I'm thinking, Rod Nash, you're wrong. Wilderness is what there was before there were states of mind. It exists objectively, even though our ideas about it may change. Philosophers talk about reference, which can be constant through changes in meaning. That's to say, water has shifted its meaning. It's H2O now, but water to your great-grandparents didn't mean H2O. Gold has shifted its meaning to an element in the atomic chart. Star has shifted its meaning, but we still know what we're talking about, don't we? Wilderness, I think, can shift its meaning, but we still know what's there. Here's one of the worst statements ever made by two philosophers. The idea of wilderness is ethnocentric, androcentric, phallocentric, unscientific, unphilosophic, impolitic, outmoded, and genocidal. Who would ever want to have anything to do with it? Says Baird Collicott, Mike Nelson. Well, what you're seeing here is nearly all wrong, and much of it is totally wrong. We may be told, well, no, ideas of nature are in our mind. It's a Western, male, modern idea. Christians have some idea of wilderness, Buddhist, Taoist. Druids have a different concept of nature. Native Americans don't think like Einstein did, do they? So now we'll be told, some think of it as God's creation, the great chain of being, a clockwork, chaos, an evolutionary ecosystem, Gaia or Mother Nature, a cosmic egg of some sort, appearance, illusion, samsara, sunyata, yang and yin, the Tao. All these are ideas of the natural world which are created in the human mind. Nature is not so much out there, it's a category, Neil Everton says, and we reinvent the category. It's a social creation of nature. Nature is a kind of a bucket idea into which many people put many different things. Wilderness, different wilderness. In the wilderness, there's no date. It's not Thursday up in the Rattlesnake. It's not 11:30 a.m. There are no lines of longitude or latitude there, are they? So now they say, well, the wilderness is like that. It's a kind of lens through which we choose to see things. Wild, in that sense, they say, is as much a construct as West. And if you get smart, you see this. A modern word that we get smart about how we've constructed. Well, it's not in the Spanish or Danish language. Aboriginal peoples don't have that word, although there's some dispute about this. But the word wild is in precursors of the English language. Words translated as wild are found 300 times in the Bible. There can be new words, even if wilderness is a somewhat newly formed word, that still catch something that's out there in nature. Krebs cycle, DNA, the Permian extinction. None of our great-grandparents knew these words, nor did Native Americans. But it doesn't follow that these ideas don't get something which is objectively there in the natural world. They are constructs of the mind, but they enable us to detect what's not in the mind, and you don't get confused about how you see with what you're seeing, even though you know that your ideas to some extent shape what you can see. Maybe we now have the word wilderness better to see these foundational forces that weren't so well known to earlier peoples. It's an idea, you want to call it a myth, I don't like that word. We recently set up, but we did so because we discovered these foundational elemental forces. We want to conserve it for what it is in itself, naturally there. It's primordially there. Though only lately do we create legislatively wilderness. Thinking anciently, thinking ongoing, thinking primordially. Well, no. Calicut, others come back and say, I am ethnocentric, I'm naive, because the Native Americans transformed the landscape. For 10,000 years, 14,000 years. My question is, did they really transform landscapes beyond the range of spontaneous self-restoration? They had some agriculture. They didn't have that much agriculture in these parts of the world we're now in. They had bow and arrow. They had spears. They had fire, it will be said. And they could burn landscapes, which is true. But it's also true that forests in the Americas have been burning for millions of years, as we know from fossil charcoal deposits. Want a fire? You got to have fuel build up. You got to have a source of ignition. Then it may burn for days, for weeks. But I'm taught by fire ecologists, yes, you can set a fire by careless camping, or a lightning bolt can set a fire, but the source of ignition is not that critical. What really counts is, do you have fuel enough to maintain a fire? Be hard to get one going if you don't have the fuel. But if you have the fuel, it'll soon get going. I rode the Flathead with Smoke. One weekend when we were there, lightning set 40 fires. If conditions are right, yes, you can start it today. If not, lightning will start it year after next. In the Scapegoats, again with Smoke, I rode over an area that burned, one of the largest fires in the history of Montana. I think Smoke says he even heard the bolt of lightning that started the fire. Big fire. But fires are quite natural over the long time span. I lived not too far from Long's Peak. One summer storm, I was down that way. The radio said next morning there were 3,600 lightning strikes in 1 hour. U.S. landscape is hit all year long, about 10 strikes on average in each square mile. What I'm saying is that the Native Americans, maybe they could start fires, maybe they had bows and arrows. What did they really do to manage the Grand Canyon or Mount Rainier or Yellowstone or the Great Smokies or the Everglades, right? They didn't have machinery. They didn't have iron plows. They didn't have horses. They didn't have cattle. They didn't have wheeled carts. And everybody knows who's been in the backcountry, it's tough to stay alive in those simple conditions. But did they manage wilderness so much that we can't now think of wilderness? And I don't find anyone who can really tell me that presently designated wildernesses are significantly different now from what they would have been if there'd been no Native Americans. Well, yes, the floor of Yosemite, but not the backcountry in Yosemite. Yes, a few spots in the Bob Marshalls, but not the landscape as a whole. Even in Montana, Native Americans have designated their own wilderness. The Mission Mountains Tribal Wilderness. I'm not prepared to accept the idea that there's no wilderness designation possible because of what Native Americans did to the landscape. Neither the mind nor the hand has made it impossible. Can't we think of the world that runs itself? Ethics is for people. Yes, we need ethics for people. I don't think there's much or any ethics in the natural world. Does it mean we have no ethics for the natural world? Environmental ethics is more inclusive, more comprehensive. We can and ought set aside these natures for what they are in themselves. We're the dominant species. We're the moral species. We celebrate a world that can run itself. Forests are characteristic of the creative process. We cannot ignore the natural world. Forces that transcend ourselves. Life persists in the midst of its perpetual perishing. Flowers, fruits pass away, life passes on. Birth, death, life forever regenerated. It's a deeper sense of baseline that I want. Life or death, survive. Wildlands accentuate these kind of basic touchstones, set off from town and commerce, but quite genuine, quite primordially natural. We may be entering an Anthropocene epoch, but I want there always to be this unmanaged, untrammeled, wild nature. We're going to be managing the planet. What kind of planet do we want? What kind of planet can we get? We're asked. I'm quite sure, and I hope everyone in this room shares my conviction, that we do not want a denatured life on a denatured planet. There ought to be once and future nature. In the Bob and on our planet. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Holmes. Our second speaker is Christopher Preston. Christopher, as you'll note as soon as he starts talking, is not a native of Montana, but has been shaped by straddling both sides of the Atlantic Ocean, being raised in England, but spending a lot of his time here in Montana and other parts of North America. And we are very fortunate, he is now teaching and writing environmental philosophy here at the University of Montana in our Department of Philosophy. Christopher's written a lot, including a wonderful biography of Holmes Rolston. It's part of their friendship that emerged out, called Saving Creation, Nature and Faith in the Life of Holmes Rolston. But I became aware of Christopher's work with an earlier work. Christopher is deeply thoughtful about the whole notion of a sense of place that informs a lot of us who live here in Montana, trying to make sense about what it means to live and occupy and be embodied in this place here. And he wrote a book called Grounding Knowledge, Environmental Philosophy, Epistemology, and Place. He's also co-edited two important anthologies, an earlier work called Nature, Value, and Duty, and a more recent work on the whole emerging field of geoengineering called Climate Engineering, the Ethics of Solar Radiation Management. Christopher's on the leading edge of ethicists who are trying to take seriously or look at the ethical dimensions of proposals about geoengineering or climate engineering on our planet as a way of dealing with climate change here. Christopher's published widely in areas of value theory, ecofeminism, public health and environmentalism, environmental epistemology, the embodied mind. He's raised in England. We're lucky he now lives in Montana, and we welcome here to our platform today. Christopher?
Is the mic on? Yeah. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Holmes. So we all know that the wilderness idea has a strong association with the United States, perhaps particularly with the Mountain West. But this session is on the ethical imperative of wilderness, and ethicists are often interested in how universal imperatives can be. So there's two questions that I want to try and get at today. One is to ask if the ethical imperative is uniquely an American imperative. And the other is to pick up on a theme of this conference is what the troubled future holds for this ethical imperative. And so I want to ask whether anything we learn by answering that first question can perhaps help us to answer this second question. Now, in the panel last night, the conversation started with a discussion of people's personal experiences of wilderness or wildness. And so if you'll let me sort of indulge myself here a little bit, I want to give you a feel of how I grew up coming to understand this term. I grew up in a country that has no wilderness. And I mean that in two senses. It has no wilderness in that there are no designated areas, but it also has no wilderness in the sense that the idea or the concept is not one that's in wide use. I don't really remember using that term wilderness in my childhood. So that's where I grew up. That's about 1.5 miles from where my parents still live. That's the Seven Sisters. Seven Sisters come out of the Cookmere Haven, and the Cookmere River flows inland for about 6 or 7 miles. That's Firle Beacon, and nestled at the foot of Firle Beacon are villages with names like Alfriston, Selmerston, Littlington. And stretching to the north of the beacon there is what they call the Sussex Weald. I also spent a bunch of my childhood in Yorkshire, so here we are up in the Yorkshire Dales. Country gets a little more rugged as you get up that way. The human history is ever present, so here is one of the monasteries that King Henry VIII decided weren't compatible with his marriage choices. It got dissolved. And here's the North York Moors, where I did my first sort of hiking and camping. Beautiful country, as you can see. But again, always sort of traces of human presence. So at age 22, I got on one of these and flew from the right side of the screen to the left side of the screen. Landed here, which is where I met Holmes. It's about nearly a quarter of a century ago. Got some formal education there. Got a little more formal education there. Got a lot of informal education there in the summers and some winters. And then I made my home here. Now, part of what I did is I became educated into the idea of wilderness. And so here in Colorado, you can imagine me coming from that English landscape, camping out in landscapes like these, hiking across landscapes like these, and learning a little bit about what this word means, what the concept means. Up in Alaska, the word and the concept became even more elemental. Felt like one could sort of get in closer touch with these fundamental processes. You encounter characters who impress on you what wild means. And you do things that also make you think more about wildness and what its impacts and its imports are. And then you find a place to call home. So as I became educated into the wilderness idea, both formally and informally, I started to understand a little bit of the ideas of people like Henry David Thoreau and people like John Muir, himself obviously an immigrant too, but somebody who drank deeply from the landscape and formed for himself this idea of the wild. And to understand the importance of the work of people like Bob Marshall, without whom we probably wouldn't have something like a Wilderness Act. Now, part of what I learned in that American idea of wilderness, or wildness, because I think wildness is the concept that underlies wilderness, is a fairly strong separation between culture and nature, or between culture and the wild. And I think you can explain that, why that is the idea here in several ways. mean, one is the simple fact that when you get out on some of these landscapes, you just don't see that many people. And you just don't see, at least to the untrained and even to the moderately trained eye, you just don't see the traces of those human impacts. Another reason, perhaps, is that we have foundational documents here that contain language that emphasizes that separation of humans from nature. Untrammeled is a word that's going to get used a lot over the course of this conference. And the idea that humans are visitors who should not remain. And then I think perhaps another source of the idea of humans and nature being separated is the work in environmental philosophy, which really kicked off in the 1970s and the 1980s. And the foundational debates were between characters like these, one of whom is recognizable to us today. And these debates over the intrinsic natural value emphasized the wild as having some value whether or not humans were there. And in fact, if humans were not there, there would still be value in wild nature. So a powerful ethical imperative based on the wild was something I picked up and learned and became pretty committed to. And if you ask me to distill what that ethical imperative were based upon, I would probably say this, that continuity, wilderness areas, if you like, are threads that connect us to that pre-human past. Whatever the human impact has or hasn't been in the last 15 or 50,000 years, there was a time, let's say 200,000 years ago, before the evolution of modern humans, where there was no human impact. And that thread that connects us to that past seems to be an important thread. This acknowledgement of otherness, and this was really displayed in last night's panel, where people were sort of reaching for that language of encountering something other, something non-human, something different. And that provides an ethical imperative. Otherness is a word that ethicists use quite a bit when they're discussing our moral motivations. Humility and restraint, that seems to be an important component of the ethical imperative. And also respect for other life forms. That might be a subset of the acknowledgement of otherness. But the idea that those creatures like those bears and those whales, those songbirds, we should have some respect for their intrinsic value. So that ethical imperative became pretty clear to me, and I don't know how many of us in this room share that imperative based upon reasons like these, but you saw them in Holmes's talk. Some sort of variation of these kinds of ideas are fairly common, I think, in the idea of wild nature. But as we all know, there is a troubled future ahead. And the challenges to the idea of the wild come from numerous quarters, and one of them was just discussed in the previous talk, the idea that we've got the history wrong, that these landscapes are not actually pristine. And wild doesn't actually mean untouched. So there's a historical challenge. There's an ecological challenge based on habitat destruction, non-native species, and the transformation of ecosystems. There's the climate challenge, and Don Worcester referred to Bill McKibben's work, his idea that nature is now ended. There's no part of the landscape that doesn't reflect in some fashion human action and activity. And then there's the social challenge, which the previous talk discussed in some detail, the idea that wilderness is an idea, it's something you learn, and admittedly that's what I did, is I learned the wilderness idea. And so it's only an idea. It's created or constructed by society. And certainly it's maintained through legislation. There's things you have to actually do legislatively and managerially to maintain wilderness. And then there's another dimension of the social challenge, which is to say that separating humans from nature in the first place is just conceptually flawed. It's just the wrong thing to do. Darwin taught us that humans are natural. Transforming environments is part of what humans do. And so to imagine that we can even think of the world in terms of places where humans live, the city and the rural areas, and places where humans are visitors who do not remain, the wild areas, that's just conceptually flawed. Holmes had a slide of the worst ever quote from an environmental philosopher. This is my version of the worst ever quote from an environmental philosopher. Paul Wapner suggests, because of this social challenge, that wilderness in many ways is the antithesis of the wild. So these challenges, I think, can be summed up in this idea of the Anthropocene, the so-called age of man, the age in which humans dominate the planet. And that's both a sort of empirical observation. As a matter of fact, the planet is dominated by humans. And also a prescriptive observation that as a matter of moral ought, humans ought to manage the planet. And if that's the case, then we live in a post-natural age, after the end of nature, where the landscape is post-wild. Now, this is the challenge. This is the troubled future. And so we need to know if that ethical imperative, which, speaking biographically, for me, that was very strong, very sort of embedded after those first sort of 10, 15 years living amongst these landscapes. If that ethical imperative is going to survive into the future. Where do we look for some inspiration? Well, let's look at Europe. So the term rewilding is associated with people like Dave Foreman, Michael Soule, and it's associated with North America, but there's a lot of very interesting stuff on rewilding going on in Europe at the moment. And this graphic is revealing for how you see the threads of nature have started to kind of come apart, and the idea of rewilding is to let those threads kind of reconnect with each other and bind back into each other. In Don Worster's talk, we heard compelling indications of how demographics are going to create opportunities. If you look at the green sections, these are areas of Europe that are becoming depopulated and less used for agriculture. And so these are all opportunities for rewilding. And the rewilding community in Europe uses terms like these: new nature, nature development, post-industrial nature. And I think you have to admit that to the American ear, there's something paradoxical in these terms. The idea that you can create new nature, or you can develop nature, or that there can be a post-industrial nature. It's a little odd. It's just a little odd when we think of nature in those historical terms and reaching back to an untouched past. But these are terms being used in the rewilding movement in Europe. Now, these terms they're not highly defined, and so I'm using them a little liberally here, but I want to give some indications of what new nature might look like in Europe. Some of you might have read about the Oostvaardeplassen in the Netherlands, an area that was slated for development, but by some sort of quirk of economics and politics was actually set aside and then repopulated with animals and just sort of left to its own devices. So there's conic horses in there, there's roe deer, there's red deer, there's het cattle, and as much as is possible, natural processes dominate in the Oostvaardeplassen. That's about a 16,000 acre area not too far from Amsterdam. There's the Melingowaard, which is on the Vaal River near Nijmegen, where summer dikes have been taken down and the land has been able to experience fairly regular periodic flooding. Bird life is recovering. Again, some species have been reintroduced into that area, Galloway cattle in this case. But that nature development has involved a fair amount of manipulation of the landscape. And so in order to bring that landscape back, if you like, you put a break in that, or you create a sort of rupture where human influence becomes very intense for a while. And then the human influence goes away. You do more now so you can do less later. Though it's worth noting that in the Melingowaard, in 30 years' time, there's an agreement that the brick companies that historically used that landscape for clay for making bricks will be able to come back and scrape out some of the sediment and still make bricks. So there's a sort of economic accommodation made in this nature development in the Melingowaard. But as you can see, it's a pretty wild-looking place, natural processes mostly dominating. Just a sort of side note about species surrogates. Of course, in Europe, some of the species that shape the land have disappeared. So there's the auroch, gone. So what are you going to put in place instead of aurochs? Well, you have some options. Some of the wilder breeds of cattle in Europe. In particular, there's one breed, the Heck cattle, which were backbred by two German brothers in the 1920s to look pretty much like aurochs. It was an experiment to see if they could get pretty close. And one of the brothers said, "We're there, we've got it. This is the auroch." There's a sort of subplot here in the Heck brothers. One of them particularly was a fairly fervent Nazi. And these Heck cattle sort of fit with the Nazi ideology of a pure, original breed. And so there's sort of this cloud of suspicion around these Heck cattle. In the Milingavad, Galloway cattle are present and not Heck cattle because there's more people in the Milingavad, more people visiting it, and the Galloways are supposed to be a little more docile. The Heck are supposed to be a little more aggressive. And the politics of Heck cattle spilled over into the United Kingdom when a farmer in Devon wanted to bring some of those Heck cattle onto his landscape. And the British tabloid press, and anybody who's familiar with the tabloid press in Britain would know that they are sort of irreverent, crass, and often overtly xenophobic. When the British press learned about these Heck cattle arriving in Devon, there were headlines like "Giant Nazi cows on the loose in Britain," "Heil Heifer," and this one, "The Herd Reich." But you can see at the bottom there, it says, "The Herd Reich, a Nazi piece of work," aurochs. But those Heck cattle are still there in Devon and apparently not causing too much strife to the English countryside. Post-industrial nature, this is an interesting place. It's a steel mill where nature is being encouraged to come back. It's being planted out, it's being open for recreation, and in some places it's being allowed just to run wild. So you've got the old kind of coal bunkers that was used to create the heat to produce the steel that in some cases have been planted, in some cases are just regrowing. And you've got this hybrid of culture and nature and this post-industrial wildness. And as you can see, you get these very odd juxtapositions of birch trees sprouting out of old railroad tracks. Incidentally, a little bit of that is starting to happen in the United States, and this is up in Vermont, where an old coal power plant has just been, Burlington has just decided to sort of redevelop it into this sort of hybrid, natural, wild area. So that rewilding in Europe comes with some concessions, right? And I think it's fair to say that those Europeans who rewild have to overtly accept the history, they have to overtly accept the current influence, they have to overtly accept a future influence, and in the case of the Milingavad, they have to accept that economic interest in wildness. Now, I'm not suggesting at all that those European ideas will be imported into the United States, because there are significant differences. Scale is one of them, right? You've got 1.5 million acres in the Bob Marshall complex versus 16,000 at the Oostvaardeplassen. The continuous presence of certain animals, I think, is a difference. They're talking about reintroducing lynx into the United Kingdom, but they're not there. I mean, they would have to be brought back. Whereas, at least in many places in the United States, you can imagine species making their way back by themselves, or at least you don't have to sort of think completely outside of the box to imagine those species coming back. In the United States, I think there's more of an emphasis on predators. In the European context, I've heard Franz Vera say, herbivory is the definition of wilderness. So it's a wilderness approach from the grass upwards, basically, and I think that's a difference. And then cultural differences that were mentioned last night by Bill Cunningham. The sort of individualism, the sort of rugged Western US image versus, for example, an image of the Dutch. But there are some lessons, even though those wilderness ideas from Europe those rewilding ideas are not going to be imported directly into the United States, there are some lessons. Howard Zahniser used the word untrammeled in a future-oriented sense. And George Nikas from Wilderness Watch here in Missoula has helped impress this upon me. Unmanaged for the future. And Zahniser says, we're not fighting progress, we're making it. So untrammeled is not a retrospective word. It's a prospective word, looking to the future. The idea of a relative wild, and Kurt Meine, who is a Leopold biographer, has been pushing this in the last year or so, and will continue to push this, that Leopold himself had an idea of wildness being relative, coming in all sorts of different degrees and kinds. There's the work of people like Bill Cronin and Emma Maris. Maris's quite well-known book, Rambunctious Gardening, suggesting that we can do stuff to make places wild, where a cultural role is acknowledged and a cultural presence is welcomed. And a lot of environmental philosophers, Dan talked about a sort of older and younger generation, at least in the early days of environmental philosophy, there was not much room for compromise on these ideas of cultural landscapes. They were the antithesis of the wild, and that perhaps is shifting a little bit. And so what would this imperative look like in the future? Well, here's some well-known European rewilders, and just look at what they say about that ethical imperative. George Monbiot says, resisting the urge to control nature. Wouter Helmer, who directs Rewilding Europe, says, landscape should surprise you. Nature must speak freely, give nature the tools to express itself. Franz Vera, the herbivory guy, says wilderness is not some green space, it's there for its own sake, that intrinsic value. We humans are not its stewards, but its guests, visitors who shall not remain. And so when you look at the ethical imperative coming from Europe, it's almost the same. Right? It's slightly different in that first sense, in that there's more acknowledgement of the human history and the human presence. But in those other senses, the ethical imperative remains very similar to what it feels like it is in the United States. My final slide. You remember those two slides from the beginning where I grew up? That's an aerial shot, and you can see how the Oxbow Lakes were created by that canalization of the Cookmere River. So in the last year or so, when I've been returning home to visit my parents, I've been hearing that there is a move to uncanalize that river and let that landscape of the Cookmere Haven rewild. Thank you very much.
Can we have the microphone up here so for questions to come again? Great, there it is. I had a bunch of questions prepared, but I'm going to go right to people who may want to respond in the interest of time here, but I wanted to make just a couple comments that I think I was struck by how both of your presentations dovetailed nicely with the previous presentation by Donald Worster, who talked about a real pragmatism beginning to emerge. And Christopher, your notion here of not so much an either or set, but a whole range of different kinds of options for different ways of thinking about how we take seriously the wild, conservation of the wild. Donald Worster talked about that maybe we don't need to have just the North American concept of wilderness expanded worldwide, but actually this different ways of respecting the wild and conserving nature's value can take place in culturally appropriate ways and diverse ways around the world. So seeing the rewilding effort in Europe as being a complement to, not necessarily competing with, North American models of wilderness, but each can learn from each other along those lines there. Let me start by asking just whether either Holmes or Christopher, you have any comments you want to make to the other in terms of presentations, or if we want to just move it up and open it up for conversation. Holmes, anything? Okay. The microphone's open. Do we have any folks who would like to address either questions or comments to our panelists?
I've been in wilderness on all 7 continents. Yes, all 7. And wilderness does differ from continent to continent, times and places. Europe is the continent with the least wildness. Many say Europe has, many say most continents have at least 1/4 of the landscape that can be thought of as wild, but not Europe. Therefore, we're delighted to hear Europe thinking of rewilding Europe as well.
Hi, Professor Rolston and Preston. I am one of your former students, both of you. I'm going to speak later this afternoon. And so it's a huge honor and privilege for me to have the chance to hear you guys speak today about wilderness. And my question to you is, as one of your former students and somebody who's had the honor of listening to each of you for a semester or so, when you are up there speaking in front of your students, whether they're undergraduates or graduate students, what are you hoping to inspire in the next generation in terms of thinking of this troubled future?
I want to make them three-dimensional persons. To know how to live well, urban, rural, and wild. I want them to hope that they will not live a denatured life on a denatured planet.
Pat Williams talked last night about the extreme polarization, 100% for or 100% against. And I think I'd like to encourage a little bit more flexibility. Now, what I'm saying about that human impact, we should sort of accept that human impact. That might not be as strongly applicable to wilderness areas, ones that we want to designate as formal wilderness areas, as it might be to areas that are sort of in buffers or ecotones or on the edges. So I certainly don't want to translate that European experience into the American Wilderness Act experience. But a little bit of flexibility, perhaps a little more flexibility than we currently see, might encourage that fundamental experience, that feeling, that emotional connection, which is really at bedrock what the wilderness imperative is about.
I think that there's one word students need to learn the meaning of. The word enough. That's limits, if you like.
I have a very pedestrian question. I'm wondering, when environmentalists, including our speakers today, think about wilderness and wildness and civility, do you think about how people drive in cities and how drivers respect or fail to respect pedestrians who are crossing the street? Do you think about what goes on every day in crosswalks in cities in America and in different ways in other parts of the world?
Depends on where you are. If you're in California, you can get in a crosswalk pretty safely. In most states, no. You got to look both ways. In Colorado, we're learning. Automobile drivers are a whole lot more careful approaching crosswalks now than they were 10 or 15 years ago. But the most difficult people to deal with are not the pedestrians and not the drivers, but the bicycle riders, right? They behave like pedestrians when they want to, and they behave like automobiles when they want to. They're unpredictable, and I predict if I ever have an accident, which I regret, it'll be hitting a bike rider.
One of the things you learn riding your bike in the city is that there is plenty of wildness in the city. And that can be from other people, or it can be from that unseen ice that you encounter on the road. And so the idea that there's wildness in the city is something people like Bill Cronin have been urging us to acknowledge, and I think bicycle riding actually gives you a little window into that.
One of the things you watch for is eye contact, and we have more of that. You're the driver looking, you see if you can see the biker's eye or the other person's eye, and you may give them a little signal to go this way or that. They may throw up a hand, thank you, or so forth. So it sort of adds more of a personal dimension to the driving, walking, bike riding dimension.
I want to follow up on and ask you both a question that came out of both of your presentations, and that's the critique sometimes that the wilderness is a flawed concept because embedded in it is necessarily the kind of the problematic nature-culture dualism that has shaped much of the Western tradition. And I'm wondering, I'm proposing that pick up something you said, Christopher, that could we not rather think of it instead as being a concept that embeds the virtues of humility and restraint, so that it's not so much that nature and culture oppose each other, but that wilderness becomes one expression within culture of practicing the virtues of humility and restraint towards other members of the natural community, of which humans are one, but it recognizes others are part of that community as well.
I think a point that Don Worcester made this morning, and one that Holmes Rolston has made pretty clearly in his work, is that there are important senses in which humans are different. Humans do ethics. Humans decide to restrain themselves. And so on those grounds alone, having a nature-culture distinction, and having a fairly clear one, that remains important, I think. If you want to cash it out in terms of virtues and restraint and humility, that's fine. You know, that works. But despite everything I laid out today, I think there's some merit in the nature-culture distinction.
Christopher, you were well taught.
Well, I think in terms of when I talk with my students, there's a difference between pointing out relevant and appropriate differences and necessarily seeing those as opposing dualisms. And I think so there's been a lot that's been appropriately critiqued about the nature-culture dualism that's informed the West, but that doesn't mean there aren't relevant distinctions and differences between nature and culture that are still important to recognize.
Yeah, it's part of and apart from. I think I amply said that humans need to have a sense of being part of these natural systems out of which they came, but yes, out of which they came. In some sense, we left wild, spontaneous nature to become cultured. I opened my talk remembering that Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, not many days differently from when he signed the Wilderness Act, and suggesting that Montana might be a state that knows how to be both civilized and wild, preserve the wildness. Is that dualism or not?
Dane has a word for us here, but let's first thank our panelists, Holmes and Christopher, for a really stimulating conversation.